The glow of three curved monitors casts a cold, sterile light across the dark room. At 29, John is a senior software engineer whose daily existence revolves around eliminating variables and optimizing logic. He does not gamble. He builds deterministic systems designed to execute with absolute mathematical precision. The silence in the room is physical, heavy, broken only by the rhythmic, deliberate clicking of a mechanical keyboard. He is writing the architecture of his own wealth. His approach to the financial markets is entirely devoid of human emotion. He treats the trading terminal not as a chaotic ocean, but as a solvable equation. For months, he has back-tested his option strategy against decades of historical data, meticulously isolating probabilities and standard deviations. The numbers on his screen reflect a steady, upward trajectory. The logic is sound. But intelligence is a dangerous catalyst when applied to irrational environments. John has engineered a financial structure optimized for maximum capital efficiency, deploying aggressive margin to accelerate his returns. He views idle cash as a flaw in the system, an unforgivable mathematical drag on his velocity. Every single dollar is assigned a high-leverage job. The architecture is a masterpiece of efficiency, functioning beautifully under the assumption that the climate will remain perfectly predictable. He has built a massive, load-bearing structure with absolutely zero margin for error. The conditions must remain perfect. A subtle temperature drop chills the room as the liquid-cooled processing unit hums heavily beneath his desk. On the right-hand monitor, a minor market fluctuation occurs, a microscopic red digital tick in an otherwise tranquil sea of green. He does not flinch. His back-tested algorithm dictates that this variance is well within acceptable, predictable parameters. He trusts the compiled code far more than the organic environment. He is confident, relaxed, and completely blind to the structural fragility of his own immaculate design. He believes he has tamed the chaos. He assumes the market is a clockwork mechanism that respects his intelligence. He is wrong. He has built a flawless engine, but he is driving it onto a glass bridge. The fracture is already there. We do not examine how John made his money. We dissect how the architecture of his intellect became the exact mechanism of his ruin. The human brain is a brilliant pattern recognition machine, but it suffers from a fatal, invisible pathology, the optimism bias. When a system functions flawlessly under optimal conditions, the architect assumes the weather will never change. John did not just build a financial portfolio, he engineered a high-velocity turbine powered by extreme leverage, calibrating it for a perpetual mathematical summer. He left zero margin for error. A structure built without redundancy is not a fortress. It is a tightly coiled spring waiting for a singular point of failure. The autopsy of this collapse reveals the lethal nature of absolute certainty in a probabilistic world. We are about to examine the anatomy of a margin call, a quiet, algorithmic execution that requires no human emotion to erase a decade of labor. Before we open the ledger, verify your institutional access. Access clearance confirmed below. Request procedural authorization to proceed with the dissection. The environment is sealed. The examination begins. John's base reality was secure. As a senior software engineer, his salary was a steady, predictable flow. It was safe. But for a mind calibrated for absolute efficiency, a traditional salary is nothing more than a very slow drip. Leaving cash idle in a standard account felt like a failure of imagination. It was stagnant water. He did not view the financial markets as a chaotic, irrational beast to be feared. He viewed them as a complex clockwork mechanism waiting to be decoded. He needed to compress time. He needed to force decades of wealth accumulation into a handful of years. The mechanism he chose was leverage. For the uneducated and the reckless, borrowing capital is a rapid path to ruin. For John, it was simply an architectural tool, a way to manufacture artificial gravity. This was his fatal sin of intelligence. He did not gamble on volatile rumors. He spent half a year studying the tides, calculating exactly how far he could wade into the dark water without drowning. He built a system designed to harvest small, consistent profits by using the institution's money to amplify his reach. It was deeply logical. It was perfectly defensible. The initial deployment was flawless. The physical environment of his office reflected this frictionless ascent. The room hummed with the quiet, expensive sound of his liquid-cooled machine, the air smelling faintly of warm ozone. The executions happened automatically in the dark. The profits flowed into his account in absolute silence. In the first 30 days, his engineered system generated a yield that eclipsed his entire monthly engineering salary. The machine was breathing perfectly, feeding him capital while he slept. The data validated the theory. The market obeyed the blueprint. He was right. The math was undefeated. Then the environment offered a subtle, almost invisible warning. On a quiet Tuesday in October, a minor tremor passed through the global markets. A sudden, unexplained shift in the wind. His portfolio absorbed a heavy, immediate blow, pushing his structural load dangerously close to its maximum limit. The system shuddered under the pressure. The walls groaned. But because his initial design was still somewhat conservative, the architecture held. The dark water receded. The structure survived the stress test. A survivor should feel relief. John felt only validation. This successful defense catalyzed a fatal shift in his psychology. The relief mutated instantly into structural arrogance. He stopped respecting the deep, unpredictable nature of the ocean and began treating it like a heavily chlorinated swimming pool, a controlled, sterile environment where he alone dictated the depth. If his glass bridge could survive that impact, it could obviously carry more weight. To optimize his velocity, he made a conscious, deeply rationalized decision to turn up the dial. He borrowed more gravity. The architecture was becoming dangerously top-heavy. He was constructing a massive financial skyscraper, but he was using rented steel to build the upper floors. This is the lethal nature of financial cannibalism. Leverage is a living organism that feeds on your own equity to sustain its massive weight. As long as the market moved in his favor, his returns easily outpaced the hunger of the borrowed money. It was a perfectly controlled burn. But the sheer mass of the structure meant that any future stress would not be gently absorbed. It would be violently amplified. The trap was completely indistinguishable from success. He had engineered his own immaculate illusion of control. He locked the variables. He did not realize he had locked himself inside the cage with them. For the next 7 months, the machine gorged itself. The numbers on the screen multiplied, but the invisible mass of the borrowed money grew twice as fast. John had successfully manufactured his own artificial gravity, and it was pulling wealth toward him at a terrifying speed. In the sterile quiet of his home office, the sheer density of his creation began to feel physical. The blue light from the monitors seemed heavier, casting longer, sharper shadows across his desk. He was balancing a massive concrete monolith on a thin glass needle, completely mesmerized by the stillness of the stone. The danger of perfect conditions is that they breed a lethal amnesia. When the sun shines for too long, the architect forgets what a storm looks like. John stopped looking for cracks in the glass. He no longer viewed his aggressive strategy as a dangerous, temporary tool. It became the permanent foundation of his reality. He was operating a massive, heavy engine at maximum capacity, assuming the wind would never change direction. He built a fortress that required eternal summer to remain standing. He left zero room for survival. But the world is not a closed, perfectly coded loop. It is an organic, irrational, and deeply unforgiving ocean. In late November, the weather finally changed. It did not begin with a dramatic crash or a screaming headline on the news. It started as a subtle, terrifying stillness. A deep, invisible undertow began to pull the tide outward. The green numbers on his screen simply flattened. The forward momentum died. This is the quiet terror of borrowed gravity. It cannot survive standing still. Borrowed money is a hungry, living organism that requires constant forward movement to feed itself. When the upward climb stopped, the extra weight stopped acting as a tailwind and instantly became a massive iron anchor. The cost of carrying that much weight began to eat his own money from the inside out. The oxygen in the room began to thin. The machine was starving, and it began to feed on its creator. The glow on the screen slowly bled from green to a dull, persistent red. The invisible walls of his pristine environment began to close in, shrinking his world by the millisecond. John leaned closer to the glass, the cold light reflecting in his unblinking eyes. He felt a sudden physical tightness in his chest, the visceral nausea of an engineered trap springing shut. But he did not step back. His pride dictated that this was just a temporary shadow. He trusted his flawless blueprint over his own survival instincts. The water was rising, but he refused to leave the golden cage. At 2:14 p.m., the illusion broke. There was no warning, no news alert. Just a sudden, violent drop. The floor simply vanished beneath him. The market, which he thought he had tamed, suddenly snapped back like a wild animal. The borrowed money, the heavy gravity he had used to pull wealth toward him, instantly reversed direction. It was no longer lifting him up, it was dragging him down into the dark. He wasn't the master architect of his life anymore. He was just a man locked inside a falling elevator. A single sharp chime broke the silence of the room. It wasn't a simple notification. It was an ultimatum. The system he used to borrow the money was now demanding to be fed. It needed actual cash, immediately, or it would burn his entire portfolio to the ground to protect itself. A cold, physical nausea hit John's stomach. He sat frozen, staring at the violent red cascade bleeding down his screens. He had built a massive, heavy structure that required the sun to shine forever, and now the earth was shaking violently beneath it. The algorithmic model is breaking. The margin requirement increases in exactly 4 minutes. Do you accept the mathematical loss, or do you deploy emergency liquidity to force the equation to balance? Submit your structural diagnosis below. The descent was no longer a slide, it was a freefall. The numbers on his screens blurred into a violent, continuous stream of red. The room felt entirely drained of oxygen. The system he built to accelerate his life was now violently compressing his chest. The broker's automated protocol was merciless. It did not care about his intellect, his past victories, or his flawless historical data. It only cared about the massive weight of the borrowed money. And the money was starving. It demanded immediate fuel. Panic is loud, but absolute terror is silent. John stared at the flashing deficit, his mind desperately trying to code a logical exit. Accepting the loss meant accepting structural failure. It meant the algorithm was wrong. For a mind wired for absolute perfection, that reality was intolerable. His eyes shifted to a secondary screen, displaying his actual, real-world savings account, his emergency fund, his pure liquid oxygen. The capital meant strictly for his survival outside the cage. The irreversible decision was made not out of wild panic, but out of a cold, deeply flawed rationality. He convinced himself that the violent drop was just a statistical anomaly, a temporary glitch in the weather. He just needed to brace the walls for a few more minutes until the sun came back out. With 3 heavy, deliberate keystrokes, he wired his entire life savings directly into the burning furnace. He took the very lifeboats meant to save him and threw them into the engine room just to keep the sinking ship's lights on. For exactly 11 minutes, the illusion returned. The flashing red warnings on his terminal vanished. the margin deficit was temporarily satisfied. The heavy, suffocating pressure in the room seemed to lift just enough to let him take a single, shallow breath. He leaned back in his chair, the glow of the monitors illuminating the cold sweat on his forehead. He believed he had bought enough time. He thought he had outsmarted the storm. The ocean did not care. At 2:31 p.m., the market took another violent, unprecedented plunge. The temporary floor he had just purchased with his life savings shattered instantly. The artificial gravity doubled in force. The borrowed money, now heavier than ever, violently collapsed inward. There was no second warning, no countdown timer, no opportunity to negotiate with the dark water. The collapse was profoundly, terrifyingly quiet. There was no dramatic phone call from a panicked broker. There was no shouting. It was simply lines of code protecting the institution's capital. An automated risk management script detected that John's equity could no longer support the massive weight of his leverage. In a fraction of a millisecond, the algorithm executed its primary directive. It forcefully liquidated every single position he held. It sold everything at the absolute bottom of the abyss. The chaotic red numbers vanished, replaced by a cold, static white zero. Total silence returned to the room, broken only by the steady, indifferent hum of his computer's cooling fans. The artificial gravity was gone, leaving behind a crushing, empty void. In less than 20 minutes, John had incinerated years of disciplined labor. He had engineered a flawless machine, but he built it for a world of eternal summer. The winter had arrived, and it took everything. He was ruined. The autopsy of John's portfolio reveals a fatal, fundamental misunderstanding of structural engineering. He was infected by the Perfect Conditions Delusion. John believed he had built a flawless financial engine, but he had actually constructed a massive, heavy skyscraper with absolutely zero margin for error. His algorithm was mathematically sound, but it was designed for a world of eternal summer. He assumed the market was a closed, sterile environment that would always obey historical probabilities. He failed to account for the organic chaos of the inevitable winter. When the shockwave arrived, his rigid architecture lacked the flexibility to sway in the wind. It simply shattered. The amplification mechanism of his ruin was the leverage itself. Margin is not just borrowed money, it is a rapid acceleration of time. By maximizing his capital efficiency, he entirely eliminated his ability to survive a drawdown. But his irreversible error was crossing the structural firewall. When the margin call demanded fuel, John took his emergency reserves, his actual real-world liquid oxygen, and threw it into a burning engine. He sacrificed his physical survival to protect a mathematical illusion. He anchored a sinking ship to his own neck, guaranteeing that when the structure went down, it would drag his entire reality with it. There is no malice in an algorithmic liquidation. The broker did not steal his wealth. The risk management system simply corrected an unsustainable imbalance. The market does not respect intelligence, and it does not negotiate with spreadsheets. A foundation built without redundancy is merely a trap waiting for a trigger. John spent years meticulously optimizing his variables, only to be erased in milliseconds by lines of cold, indifferent code. The winter is a mathematical certainty, and a system engineered without margin will always freeze. Case closed. The autopsy identified the fracture. The environment will test it again. The F.A.R. system, Financial Autopsy Resilience, was developed as a structural response model to the exact vulnerabilities examined here. The full documentation is archived in the description and the pinned comment below. Collapse repeats patterns. Resilience is engineered.